Hello friends, so I'm recording this video because I want to talk with you all today about one of the books that I read for this class. It's called Beyond Heterosexism in the Pulpit. It's a very, very interesting book. I would recommend it for anybody who is looking for ways to expand their preaching and also challenging the different structures that we have in society, especially those that focus on heterosexism being the norm. So right from the very beginning, the book starts off, and I think it does a nice job of describing exactly what the book's going to do, but also talking about what exactly heterosexism is. And so first off, in their definition, it says heterosexism includes all forms of sexual prejudicial attitudes, actions, and structures that contribute to personal, institutional, and societal discrimination of LGBTQI plus individuals in the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. So heterosexism isn't just one man, one woman being the norm for our society, but it's also all of those different pressures that we as gay people focus in on and actually feel in society. So there's 5 chapters within the book. The first chapter talks about anthropology and soteriology. Those are very in-depth topics, and the reason that I liked it is that it challenges the traditional imago Dei that we assume, because if we use the imago Dei and we interpret it wrong, that in itself can and will feed into heteronormativity, and could also potentially feed into homophobic attitudes. So what the author does in this book is he actually focuses on a concept known as Hesed. So Hesed is a Hebrew word, and it means basically caring love. And so instead of us all focusing on the imago Dei, especially in Genesis and all of those traditional texts, the author asked us to look into Hesed as another alternative to the imago Dei. It's not going to supplant the imago Dei, but it's there just simply to help us understand it more. So the basis for all of this heteronormativity is that for centuries, as the author puts it, they, including theologians, have interpreted the best of human creation to be our rational, spiritual natures, and that would come from God. And that would be preferred over our physical natures, which come from animals, or would seem to come from animals. So us as humans, we're able to reason and make existential meaning in a fashion other than what animals are. And that's why, in general, whenever we look at sexual practices in society, that's why the author says is why we view sexism to be more akin to animals instead of the virtues that we hold and the high theology that comes with Christianity. So that's a very important point that he makes throughout the book, and I think it really makes sense because whenever we think of homosexuality and homosexual practices as it relates to theology, that's one of the biggest things that it is. It's branded as being unnatural sex. And that would go to the idea that I just talked about that the author puts forth, is that we see sex as being animalistic. And in an attempt to be more godlike, we define sex in what is considered to be normal sex. And that has been very detrimental to the LGBT plus community. Another thing, too, that was very interesting, the author in this introduction equates and goes back to the different ways that we see men and women in the Bible. So men have characterized women in general as being more body-oriented in life. And that can kind of stem back, according to the author, to their role that they play in reproduction. In that role, women generally play a physiological role, and that includes the natural processes of menstruation, gestation, childbearing, and lactation. Now, men have used this characterization to look down on and subjugate women as being controlled by emotions and physical forces. On the other hand, men who don't menstruate or give birth have over time characterized themselves as being more intellectual and spiritual, and thus manifesting a stronger image of the divine than what women do. And again, that's a very, very outdated point of view, and it's very harmful, especially for communities, for both for both homosexual communities and also for women. So, in addition to all of this, he does a nice job of outlining what the different arguments look like. And so in the soteriological first chapter, he does a nice job of saying why heterosexism became the norm. So after he does that, he goes into the idea of what we call Hesed, and argues that whenever we look at sexual relations, we should be focusing more on the relationship that is in the fold rather than the actual act of sex itself. So in his opinion, it's all right to have homosexual acts, but with almost any relationship that you have, the relationship needs to be built on love. And that's a big argument that a lot of us use against heterosexual activities being the norm, is that the focus should be on the love and the relationship behind that type of sexual encounter rather than the actual act itself. And so that's the basis that he forms all of his argument, is on Hesed. He also goes into a lot of discussion on sin, and a lot of different ways that salvation, all of that, play into, and how they can be used to bring homosexual and LGBT plus people back into the fold. Another great thing that he does is throughout the book, he actually has a series of samples for each chapter that illustrates his beliefs, which I think are very helpful and great at the very least, providing a introduction. There's a second chapter on ecclesiology, in which he talks about how liberal and progressive churches, even though they may be open and affirming, they can still unconsciously perpetuate heterosexism based on the structures and the life of the church. A lot of this comes whenever LGBT plus couples come to a church. It's nice to have the banner above the door, but at the same time, they may not feel welcome because there's no LGBT plus people in the leadership. If LGBT plus people aren't welcomed fully into the church, or even if there's no LGBT plus clergy. So if our churches are to call ourselves open and affirming, the author argues that it needs to go further than just saying gays are welcome here, and the entire LGBT plus community, to be opening and affirming, needs to be included in that daily life and the structure of the church itself. So that's a nice chapter that he does, and that would be chapter 2. Then we get to chapter 3, and what chapter 3 does is it talks about gay rights and coming into the church. So in addition to all the different civil rights, the author argues that as a progressive church and a church that's living in a new century, it's important now more than ever that not only do churches accept gays, but they also preach in favor of different movements that are beneficial to the LGBT plus community as well. And that, at the very core, to him, starts right from the pulpit. And then he goes on, and again, he ties us back into LGBT plus people being leaders in the church. And in all of his chapters, he gives a nice sermon. And then he gets to chapter 4. This is where he talks about weddings and unions. One of the biggest points that he makes in this chapter is that weddings, for gay weddings especially, they shouldn't be held to a different standard as heterosexual weddings. In fact, what a lot of the members of the LGBT community want is not to be put out in special terms, but to be held at a same level of accountability. And this also goes on, if you truly want to be accepting of the LGBT plus community, he argues that whenever you do weddings, the focus should be on using liturgy and preaching a homily that can be used both at a homosexual and a heterosexual wedding. That way, even if you're at a heterosexual wedding, the odds are that you are probably going to have a couple members of the LGBT plus community in the audience. And if you're preaching the traditional one man, one woman, God made woman out of the flesh of Adam, and in that aspect, that could also still alienate the LGBT plus people who are part of the congregation. He also goes on to discuss a lot in his marriage chapter, but a couple of his ideas are a little outdated, and reading it, you can tell by a couple of his examples that the book was written prior to 2015 with marriage equality that came with Obergefell v. Hodges in that Supreme Court case. But other than that, it's a nice chapter. And near the end, he actually ends out his book by talking about how funerals and memorial services can be very trying, especially for the LGBT plus community. And if you ever have somebody in the community who is LGBT plus, and if they are firmly in the closet, and let's say they end up passing away, it's still a big concern that they die as they lived in life. You might find there might be questions about things, but it's really not the place of the pastor or the preacher to fully out a member of the LGBT plus community at a funeral. And that can cause even more consternation. And he also talks about different ways you can include the family into it, and also if the deceased person had a partner, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, who was also LGBT plus, and their family didn't know about that, and different ways that you can include them into the fold. And also, if you don't buy the book just for those chapters, the glossary at the very back is extremely helpful. It defines a lot of terms that are used in the LGBT plus community. And for that very aspect, I think it's progressive, because not a lot of our books discuss different language that's used in the LGBT plus community and the different identities that arise. So with that, that's pretty much all I got for you. This book is very, very interesting. And even for, it's both for homosexual, LGBT plus preachers and for pastors, but it's also for a lot of straight, heterosexual, progressive pastors who are wanting to rethink how they can be more accepting and inclusive of LGBT plus persons by changing the language, by changing the liturgy, and just by opening up in different ways that you might have thought of. So I like the book. I'm going to continue to read it and use it in my ministry, and I hope that after rewatching this, you might actually consider getting this book and checking it out. Again, it's called Beyond Heterosexism in the Pulpit, and let's see if I can find the author. And it is written by, I should know this, Emily Askew and O. Wesley Allen Jr. Again, that's Beyond Heterosexism in the Pulpit. Happy reading, friends.